Okay, this project is called Strength Training Habits of Amateur Endurance Runners in the U.S. It's a pilot study. The idea is to get a better scope of what type of strength training habits the endurance runners are utilizing to prevent injuries. I'm Ramel Walkai. I go by Mel. So what I want to go through here is a little bit of the background first. The lower extremity injuries that occur commonly among runners. So 7 out of 10 experience at least one running-related injury. So when you look at like novice versus recreational, there's a little bit of a difference. The recreational athlete is probably the largest group of runners that experience injuries, and the largest group that add marathons and large-scale events from ULA to ultra. So the recreational runner will experience anywhere from 7.7 to anywhere up to 16 is what was in the literature, I believe. So ultra marathoners, they're a little bit lower than that in terms of 7.2, but if the distance is a lot further. So the 1,000-hour mark is roughly 621 miles. If we convert that into 1,000 kilometers or a time frame that anybody will be running per week, that's a significant way to convert your time and look at your incidence that occurs to get an idea of the prevalence that would occur for that running distance. Now, there's another difference between elites and professional runners. Um, this also has to do with high school as well as college track and field athletes. So I like to focus on longer in distance, anywhere from half to marathon distance all the way to ultra. So here the numbers are just putting together in this research article. So elites and professional runners from high school, collegiate, and professional runners have been noted to experience anywhere from 2.5 to 6 running-related injuries per 1,000 hours. Now, I guess the number is a little bit lower, but you also have to consider that that group of athletes is constantly being treated, and then there's other modalities that they're able to utilize. The running-related injuries that are attributed to some of these injuries, they're considered multifactorial, have to do with training eras and the training volume, and then muscle strength, which is what we're assessing if the habits of muscle strength training are being utilized to improve force production. And then another attributed factor is low energy availability or energy availability overall for endurance athletes. And then running biomechanics has been widely discussed. Dr. Crystal Miskin has discussed that as well. Next slide. So the purpose of the pilot study is to elaborate on one, marathon programs which rarely include strength training plans as injury prevention strategies, yet running-related injuries do contribute to a number of issues along their athlete's career within 1 year time frame, as you've seen before, the 7.7 all the way up to really it's about 17 injuries a year for some athletes are experienced. So the purpose of this pilot study is to first seek and understand what type of strength training habits these amateur endurance athletes are performing. And these are going to be consistent of non-professional endurance athletes. So the research question is, what are the strength training habits of amateur endurance runners, preventing them specifically from addressing these repetitive running injuries and the potential performance variables? I'll utilize descriptive statistics looking at means, frequency, and percentages first. The descriptive statistics that are described above for an N of 61, which was my sample size, the age range was anywhere from 24 to 66, which also reflects the novice and recreational athletes that are commonly seen among marathon training age groups. The average age is anywhere from 42 plus minus 10. As you can see in the chart to the right, 50% of this population, my age demographic was 44, and the median age was 42. So uniquely, majority of females responded to this survey. So at an N of 41. As you can see, 61% of females submitted input into this survey specifically. So the most frequent responses to weightlifting among runners, which is going to be our first descriptive statistics, is going to be light weights using high reps. I discussed before the light weights using high reps is a common thing among endurance athletes. However, if we're looking to improve uh, any type of strength gain that helps for neuromuscular excitatory neurons that are starting to fire, hypertrophy gains, mTOR receptors, to stimulate cell growth, we're going to look at heavy strength loads. As you can see, our heavy weights were utilized at 19% of the participants in selecting a heavy load using low weight. However, a larger number of 21.5% selected they do not train with weights. Now, another frequent comment that is made among endurance athletes is they do not utilize weight training. So our statistical information above shows 58% do not utilize weight training. As we can see, our data that looks a little bit skewed at 3.92% shows our 80 to 90% rep range, or that one rep range, utilizing a heavy load of 1 to 2 reps. Less than 4% selected that rep range. Now, that's another indication to understand why, which is also something discussed in the literature review to understand why these ideas are thought of, these behavior patterns are thought of. Second, this is the purpose of the pilot study. This is research question 2. So it has been shown that the most effective strategy to preventing sports injuries is strength training, whether it be moderate strength training, heavy strength training, or endurance type of strength training for high repetitions with lower weight loads. So the research question here is, what characteristics influence whether runners focus on injury prevention strategies by determining the sufficient training variation to prevent overuse injuries? So I selected the first hypothesis being that knowledge of heavy strength training and plyometrics could aid in as injury prevention strategies. So these variables may be related to running-related injuries. However, also selected as null hypothesis that there's no difference that exists between knowledge of heavy strength training, plyometrics, or injury prevention variables to decrease running-related injuries. The method utilized was a Likert type scale and a nominal scale for information. The descriptive information, which you saw 2 of the slides before, then also provided the means, frequencies, and percentages of the common answers. I believe I only use 7 of them currently for this study right here. So Fisher's exact test was used to determine if there is a random association between the variables. Now, there were 9 levels in number of injuries. There were also 7 levels in average maximum weight used to determine heavy strength training loads, which is why the Fisher's exact test fit into currently this statistical analysis that I ran, because there was a separate statistical analysis ran before. So the results of the Fisher exact test were not significant based on an alpha value of 0.05 at a probability of 0.267. So this suggests that the number of strength training loads could be independent of one another. At this point, I accept the null hypothesis, so that no significant difference exists between knowledge of heavy strength training and injury prevention variables, which can decrease running-related injuries. However, heavy strength training does provide benefits to improve mechanical efficiency, motor coordination, and motor unit improvement. A Spearman correlation test was also ran to determine if any of the variables had any association, as in correlation. Now, the number of injuries were still in the ordinate scale. The common weight load and repetition goals during strength training were displayed, were used as a variable. Resistance training performed per week was another variable to determine the habits that were commonly seen among endurance athletes. And the strength training days per week were also utilized to determine the habits within the higher volume endurance athletes. up to, I believe, 60 miles per week was the average. So here for the sample size, we have in this complete group of M31, the correlation that we identified is R value of 0.496 at a probability of 0.02. And this is at a narrow confidence interval at 0.17 to 0.72. No other data was significant to discuss on this one for correlations. Do this, we looked at, what is this one for? Oh, correct. Oh, this is to determine inverse relationship, if there was an inverse relationship between the variables. So this does meet, we accept this hypothesis, this does meet our standard. Some of the limitations of the pilot study were one, the survey sample. Now, although the data was misleading in the strength rate in terms of how many times a week they would be done, as well as the weight load, was inconclusive. We did determine that 61 participants fully completed the 24 questions in the survey, and then 31 participants opened the survey. However, did not complete the survey, but they did answer several of those questions. I did not imputate the data. However, I cleaned the data to get a better view of what information was provided and then how the answers were going to be utilized in the survey. Those were some of the limitations in the data and reporting it. Some were the inability to understand one rep max and what a maximum load was utilized for a strength phase of barbell hip thrust or a strength phase of dorsiflexion to prevent Achilles tendon tightness. So several of those questions were actually taken out due to the difficulty of the questions. So the limited sample size was another constraint. We were limited to several participants who, one, were outliers. A lot of these participants were collegiate, elite, and professional. They fully complete the survey, and each question was answered directly towards that professional status and then high knowledge in strength training. Now, other things, the take-home message about running-related injuries are they're attributed to multiple factors. So errors in training volume were not discussed. Training volume was only seen as average miles ran as well as the amount of miles ran in a week. So some participants may have ran an 830 per mile at 3 miles a week. Some may have ran a 530 at 15 to 40 miles per week. And then some were upwards of 120 miles per week at 630. Some of those questions had to be eliminated, but they had to be put in groups as well. So these were the limitations to how the data was going to be reported on. Heavy strength training is still a component to include in running-related prevalence analysis to understand the habits and behaviors limiting runners from addressing these overuse injuries and overuse injuries specifically at the site and location. The future outlook is to provide better insight on what strength conditioning variables specifically are to be addressed and understanding why a strength load at the glute max would be beneficial for leg hip extension and getting insight specifically on that region of the body in the lower leg. Okay, these are some of the references, and let's see, okay, this concludes the presentation. Thanks a lot.